Shalom and welcome to Inside Israel News, your source for unbiased and thorough analysis of Israeli news, politics, and current events in the Middle East. I'm your host, Mensch-Kight. Back from Israeli Independence Day break. Was an exciting supplement there, talking about all of the things leading up to Israel's creation, some of the conflict there, and talking about Israeli Independence Day with the national anthem and some Middle Eastern music. Good times. So if you haven't checked that out, check out the bonus episode, the supplement 17.1. That episode was a lot of fun to make, and I love talking about Israeli history, go on and on about it. I wanted to make a couple of notes about that. I deliberately did not talk about Egypt's participation in Israel's war for independence. The conflict with Egypt in particular, I'm going to cover in another supplement at some point, which will talk about all of Israel's conflicts with Egypt in particular, because it had four major conflagrations with Egypt, including the War of Independence, and that kind of deserves its own topic. Also, I did not address the mass exodus of Jews from the Middle East. Talked a little bit about the demographics of the time and how there were large migrations of Arabs to the region as well as Jews. But of course, then afterwards, 800,000 Jews were forced to leave the Middle East, and that's a topic for another time. So those will be covered in future supplements. Well, it's been an interesting news week. I'll dive right in. Iran. More fun with Iran. So the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has confirmed that Iran is running a 60% enrichment at an above-ground facility at Natanz, the same place where the explosion took place, so they were sabotaged. So they're enriching uranium to 60%. That is a major milestone on the path to having a nuclear weapon, and they're working at it diligently, and doesn't seem to be anything anyone wants to do about it. The Biden administration is still continuing to head toward the old Obama-era Iran deal, which the Iranians never really agreed to, never really did anything about, and never really complied with, to be honest. IAEA shows that they've continued to violate that agreement flagrantly. Anyway, so Israel is warning the Biden administration not to go back in that direction, back to the Obama-era Iran deal. And now there are sources in the Biden administration that are wishing that the Israelis would stop their chattering about the Iran deal. And it's kind of funny. It's like, well, why doesn't the Biden administration stop putting themselves in absolutely the weakest possible position in these negotiations? How about that? Instead of concerning themselves with Israel's very reasonable efforts to raise concerns about its own security, welfare, and well-being, maybe some of those people need to wake up and do their jobs right for a change. Well, we'll see, but I won't hold my breath. So that's Iran continuing to be in the spotlight these days. It's a bit of a problem. In a sort of a news story that came up in the last few weeks, there was an Israeli soldier who self-immolated recently, a veteran, set himself afire. There are a lot of problems with the treatment of IDF veterans for PTSD. And so there are some protests this week, and especially with Israeli Memorial Day recently, the remembrance for those who have died fighting for Israel, some 23,000 odd Israelis who have died fighting for the cause of the state of Israel, the world's only Jewish state. So Bibi Netanyahu has come out saying that he is going to seek reforms in the treatment of PTSD for those soldiers. The United States has had several controversies regarding the treatment of our veterans for various illnesses, and now Israel is racked with the same problem. How do we treat veterans? And that's one of those challenges. For the U.S., of course, we can just sit there and start with, well, how about we stop making more veterans? We stop fighting all these unnecessary wars. Well, Israel is surrounded by enemies, and they don't really have a choice. Those enemies are attacking them constantly. So there are a lot of traumatized soldiers, and those soldiers need to be given proper treatment. Other big news today. With the political impasse continuing, negotiations toward a coalition are ongoing. We don't have any solid news as to whether Bennett is going to finalize a deal with Bibi as yet. So that's kind of in the running, right? But in the meantime, there are a couple of stories that have come up. So we're still waiting to see what Bibi will do with Bennett. If he gets in a deal with Bennett, then it's a question of what does he do with the religious Zionists, with Bezalel Smotrich, who's opposed to Ra'am joining the coalition. And we'll see what Mansour Abbas, who leads Ra'am, chooses to do and how all of that plays itself out. That's going to be coming in the coming weeks anyway. But in the meantime, there is a discussion of the possibility that Israel might hold a direct election for prime minister. And Israel did this in the past, which I'm going to talk about after the ad break a little bit more. But there is a possibility that holding a direct election for prime minister could clear the impasse, because in this case, it really is a question of whether Bibi should continue. And if that's the question, then rather than having a fifth Knesset election, they could just hold an election for prime minister and the runoff, and then it'll be over. It'll be decided. And it'll be a matter of putting together a coalition with the parties based on this last election. So the numbers will still be the same. The coalition prospects will still be the same. And the challenges will still be the same. But at least then there will have been some kind of democratic acknowledgement of who should be prime minister. And obviously, if Bibi should lose, say, to Yair Lapid or someone else, then it will be incumbent upon that person to form a coalition, and we'll see how that all goes. In any case, that's a possibility. There's a challenge to that, though, because caretaker governments are not supposed to make major legislative reforms like that, and the Israeli Supreme Court could overturn it because, again, it's a caretaker government. However, I'm not sure the courts are going to stand in the way of a political impasse. We're not talking about a caretaker government making some kind of major legislative reform just because they can or they just want to. We're talking about a legislative reform aimed at breaking the political impasse. It's basically directed squarely at the issue that is preventing there from being a real, fully operative, functional government rather than just a caretaker government. So that's the question there. Now, in terms of support for it, in the past, there's been back and forth on this issue. Bibi has generally been in favor of it. He feels confident he would win. He polls consistently below a majority, I will say, but when it comes right down to it, head-to-head with, say, Yair Lapid, as I've mentioned polls in the past, that comes out in Bibi's favor. So if that's the case, then Bibi has a lot riding on it, but he certainly has a lot of positive prospects for winning that runoff. In any case, that's a possibility. We'll see what happens. The impasse does continue, and there's some challenges back and forth on that. Will they have enough votes to pass this? That's also a question, because even if Smotrich and religious Zionists back it, again, with Yamina, we're talking about 59 seats. So they still need 61 seats to pass a bill for a direct election. And if that's going to happen, it's not clear what Ra'am will do in terms of that vote. It's not clear what any of the opposition parties would do. In fact, if there's a direct election, like I said, there's a pretty good chance Bibi wins that. And the opposition would probably rather not go down that road. So we'll see. In other news, we have a sort of a signal on Bennett's side. Bennett is generally looking to a right-leaning coalition, but he did join in an agreement with the opposition to create the Arrangements Committee, which will be headed by a Bibi ally, but it's the committee that basically sets the committee assignments and arranges and organizes the Knesset as a legislative body. And so that deal is going to lead to Israel having, the Knesset having its organization and putting all that. However, Bennett has kind of put himself in a position where his party's vote is the swing vote, and therefore it puts him in a position that is very, very powerful in terms of Knesset organization. So Naftali Bennett looking out for himself, standing between Bibi and Yair, and we'll see where he goes with that and what he chooses to do. But again, coalition prospects continue. So when we are back from the break, I will talk about direct election of the prime minister, history of it, how it's been employed, and some of the structural challenges it presents in a parliamentary system. So I've been looking forward to the opportunity to talk about direct election of the prime minister for some time. And I want to talk about it now because there's there's a possibility, a very real possibility, that it may return to Israel. So we'll go into that, and this will be the great time to talk about parliamentary structures just a little bit. I did in several supplements, but I'm going to address it here so that I have covered all of the ground, so no one will be confused whether they decide to go for direct elections or not, or if there's a fifth election, or if a coalition is built out of the existing parliamentary factions. You'll understand what's going on. I've put a lot of time building up to and talking about the impasse of 1984, where Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir created the first rotation agreement between prime ministers, where Peres went for 2 years, then Shamir for 2 years, and after that, Shamir won a full term as prime minister in 1988. So that was a full 4-year term there. There was a lot of political fragmentation at the time, with no minimum threshold for joining parliament. In other words, parties could earn 1 seat or 2 seats if they could just get enough votes to round up, let's just say, to the next seat. So there were a lot of political parties. And more so than is common in proportional systems, Israel was fragmenting into many smaller parties, and this was making coalition building all the more difficult. And by 1990, the summer of 1990, there was this just rash of horse trading and people moving around different political parties, new parties splitting off, and just a lot of very opportunistic, very backroom, not all of it really having anything to do with the issues that were relevant to the voters, just a whole bunch of breakup and mishmash, and just, it was a mess, okay? It was a mess. Let's just suffice it to say. So the Israelis were really frustrated by that, and in order to address that particular problem, it was decided that they would have direct election for prime minister at the same time that the Knesset was chosen, and they passed that reform, which reform would go into effect for elections taking place after the 1992 election. So it did not take place in 1992. In any case, this idea of directly electing the prime minister was something that found favor with the voters. And the idea was that you would have all of the candidates presented on the ballot at the same time that the general election was held, so that all of the candidates who are on the ballot for prime minister are on, their parties are also running for Knesset. And the idea is then that, it would give everyone the strongest votes for prime minister candidates. However, as has been noted, the split vote, allowing people to have a separate ballot for prime minister and for proportional election, meant that this didn't lead to larger political parties. It didn't do that much for Labor or Likud as parties, even though their candidates ended up being the preeminent candidates. Technically, you have to win a majority in order to win the prime ministership under such a system. So technically, the law provided for a runoff 2 weeks later between the top 2 candidates if there are more than 2 candidates and no one wins a majority. However, this never became a problem in Israel because they always had 2 candidates for prime minister. In 96, it was Shimon Peres, who had taken over for the assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. In 1999, it was Ehud Barak versus Bibi Netanyahu. And in 2001, it was Ariel Sharon versus Ehud Barak. So just two on two all the way through that system. But it did not do much to improve the political system, and ultimately it was abandoned after the 2001 election, which was unique in that it was only an election for prime minister. Basically, instead of giving parliament the vote of confidence, they gave the voters an opportunity to have a vote of confidence, and they voted no confidence in Ehud Barak. So that's some of the history of it right there in a nutshell. And I'm going to go back through and talk about the numbers in just a minute. But in parliamentary systems, the foundational constitutional concept of a parliamentary system is indirect election. Much like America's Electoral College, which Walter Bagehot, who wrote the book on parliamentary systems basically, initially anyway, he pointed out that Alexander Hamilton's Electoral College was almost a parliamentary system. It's just that the electors didn't stick around and have the opportunity to vote no confidence in the president later on. Basically, if they could do that and hold another presidential election mid-term, it would be the same thing as a parliamentary system. So the idea is the voters elect a parliament. by one means or another, whether it's majoritarian, where you have single-member elective constituencies like we have here in the U.S., or proportional, where you vote for political parties and they earn seats based on their proportion of the vote. 10% votes for a party out of 120 Knesset seats, they'll get about 12, right? So 10%, okay? And that system, in Israel especially, without much of a threshold, and I've talked about the threshold. Now in Israel it's 3.25, which really does push for larger political parties, and that has helped. But for a long time it was there was no threshold, and then eventually 1% was set, and 1% isn't that difficult a threshold to cross, and then it was moved to 2%, and finally it was moved up to 3.25%. In any case, Germany has a 5% threshold, right? So in many proportional systems, they have a very high threshold. And in Germany, it's difficult to get over that 5% threshold. And they've got a couple of parties now. One of their major parties, Die Linke, which is kind of a left-wing protest party since the main left party has been joining unity coalitions with the main right party. Die Linke is now down at like 7% in the polls, and they're getting closer and closer to that electoral threshold. And so it shows you that if voters abandon that party for, say, the Green Party, if they vote for Grüne, then it's going to be the end of that party, right, if they fall below the threshold. In any case, so you get this split ballot system in Israel. The idea being that it'll be a little bit more presidential in that the people will have the choice of the individual prime minister, but it will be still parliamentary because they're going to have to form a coalition, and then it's a proportional coalition, and you have this culture challenge there. So the French have a system where they elect their president, and they have an initial general election for president. They have a runoff between the top two candidates. And there's a culture there that when the president wins, when you have chosen a president, that when you vote for parliament, you elect the president's party to a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, right? So this concept that the president won, therefore we should give the president a parliamentary majority. In fact, the UMP, the Gaullists, changed their name to UMP at one point, Union for a Parliamentary, presidential majority. Basically, we're just changed their name to we're the president's party. Literally, vote for us. We're the president's party. So you have a culture there where they want the parliament to have a majority that reflects the presidential election results. Okay, so you just imagine here if we held a presidential election, let's say in October, and then had congressional elections in November, and there's this big push, Donald Trump won, so the Republicans should win the House, or Joe Biden won, therefore the Democrats should win the House. This is that kind of cultural system. Well, in Israel, with the split ballot system, you could vote for, say, Shimon Peres for prime minister, and instead of voting for Labor, which would then give him a larger number of seats to work with to form a coalition, you could turn right around and vote for Meretz. One of the more left-wing parties, or you could vote for a centrist party, or you could vote for some other party. Theoretically, you could also vote for Likud, even though that's not, we don't imagine that happened a lot, but that's the point. Like you could vote for any party for parliament. And so that split was one of the things that led to its catastrophic failure. Basically, what direct election did was it answered this question that we've been talking about. I've talked about in the last couple of episodes, discussing here, this idea of who goes first in the coalition building process, right? Right now, the way it works, and the way it had worked before direct election, the parties recommend a candidate to the president, who is a figurehead ceremonial office, right? And the president, based on what recommendations he receives, nominates a person, a candidate, to seek a coalition. In this case, most recently, Bibi Netanyahu. That's the process. There is no rule that says that it has to be the party that won the most seats, or that, for example, there's no direct election that chooses that. So direct election of the prime minister basically answers that question. Okay, who should go first to form a coalition? And the challenge there is that it does not guarantee the prime minister that they will form a coalition, right? It doesn't give the prime minister a term in office, let's put it that way. Just like a direct election for a president in a presidential system, obviously the French system is mixed, presidential and parliamentary, but let's just use that as an example. When a for example, when François Hollande won the election, he becomes president of France for 5 years, right? He has that office. Now, even if the voters don't give him a mandate in parliament and let another party have the majority, he's still president. He's still the leader of the country, and they have kind of a power sharing arrangement that works a little bit differently there. But in any case, you have that, all right? And so then when, you have an election and, say, newcomer Emmanuel Macron kind of blows everyone else out of the water, and now he's president, right? And to show you how the French culture worked, his new party, En Marche, an entirely new center-left party, completely eliminated the Socialist Party. I mean, they had elections, and his party won a majority. I mean, they just crushed the rest. Because, again, the parliamentary principle there, the voting principle there, is that the voters vote to give the president a majority, right? And that they don't like having a split political system. So, the French had this happen to them once when Jacques Chirac was president and Lionel Jospin was the prime minister, because the Socialists had won a parliamentary election. The presidency had a 7-year term and parliament a 5, so you had this back and forth. They were not always on the same year, and so the Socialists won an election, and that left this deadlocked split government. And the French, they despised that so much that they amended their constitution to reduce the presidential term to 5 years. So in 2002, when they held their election, Chirac won another term, but he won a 5-year term, and that meant that it would correspond then with parliamentary elections for the Assemblée Nationale every time. Right? They lined that up so that it would always now be just elections every 5 years, so they would never have this issue happen. So again, in Israel, as we're looking at, the split ballot system, this doesn't guarantee the prime minister will serve in office. All it does is just determine who has the most votes. We could say an electoral mandate, the support of the people to be prime minister, but it doesn't guarantee them a coalition. It doesn't boost their votes in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's talk about these elections. So in 1996, and here's a prime example, Shimon Peres had taken over for the assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing kook who was opposed to the peace process. The peace process was making progress, but there was also a lot of evidence that Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians were not playing along. I mean, as power was slowly devolved to the Palestinian Authority run by the PLO, Fatah, the terrorist organization that Arafat led, they began to shut down newspapers and close mosques that they didn't like, and destroyed freedom of speech, expression. There were no protests allowed, and they created this sort of security police state. And as that was happening, there was a lot of pushback from people on the right that the peace process was breaking down. Meanwhile, those who supported the peace process, who were in Rabin's camp, like Shimon Peres, wanted to push forward with the peace agreement and see what would happen. And one could argue that maybe in a second term, if Rabin had survived, he might have called out the things Arafat was doing and had more credibility in that process, perhaps. But at the same time, this peace process was doomed from the beginning because there was no partner. The Palestinians were looking for a way to gain power, and ultimately the peace process broke down. Again, I've talked about Dennis Ross's book, The Missing Peace, that broke down because Arafat and the Arabs did not want to sign a peace deal. And a lot of people on the right were very concerned about it, and one person did something entirely uncalled for, murdering the prime minister, and it didn't serve the right well. In that, at the same time, it didn't change the facts on the ground because the peace deal was never going to work out anyway. Anyhow, so in this first election, Bill Clinton and a lot of people on the left really tried to push for Shimon Peres to win. Labor had this huge lead through most of the election. And Likud's leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, this was Bibi's first go as prime minister, he had a lot of popular support, but it didn't look like he had enough. And there were a series of terror attacks by Hamas. People began to feel insecure about their security. And there were a couple of influential rabbis who supported Likud. And by the end, it was a very tight, close-run election. And you can tell because at the end, Bibi won the prime ministership 50.5 50%, 0.5, 50.5% to 49.5%, with 1.5 million votes for Bibi and 1.471 million for Shimon Peres. So you can see the difference there. Now, again, that didn't give Bibi the mandate to be prime minister. It just gave him the lead, let's say, in forming a coalition. But to kind of clarify the results and this how this split ballot thing worked, Labour won 26.8% of the votes for its parliamentary faction, right, earning 34 seats. Okay, so here, we're looking at Shimon Peres wins 1.47 million votes, right? 49.5% of the vote nationally to be prime minister, just narrowly missing, just narrowly losing. And yet his party gets 26.8% for Knesset and wins 34 seats, which was actually a loss of 10 seats from the previous election. And Likud, likewise, won 25.1%. So here Bibi wins 50%, and only half those people who voted for him voted for Likud, right? And Likud earned 32 seats, down 8 from the previous election. So Likud was in worse shape, right? Meanwhile, a lot more people voted for Shas, the Haredi Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party. There were other political parties that made gains as well, but obviously the two major parties earned about a quarter of the vote each, even though their candidates for prime minister won almost a majority. Both of them were very close to a majority, about half, let's just say, of the votes. So Bibi was prime minister for 3 years. There was a bit of a scandal, understatement if there ever was one. Bibi had a sex scandal. I'm not going to go into the details. He had lost some popularity, and there was some enthusiasm to go back to the peace deal. Likud obviously being more skeptical. They began pretty immediately to point out the flaws in the peace deal, and Bibi was not entirely enthusiastic about it. He obviously did start moving Israel a little bit more in the free market direction as well, and so things were, the economy was picking up and things were generally good, but there was some enthusiasm. Well, maybe we could have a government without the ultra-Orthodox parties. Maybe we could have a government that would support the peace plan. And so with this scandal came early elections. And with that early elections, the new Labour leader, Ehud Barak, this is this fascinating election because Ehud Barak and Bibi Netanyahu stormed a plane together in 1972. There was a hostage crisis at Ben Gurion Airport. It's a fascinating story to look at. We think about our politicians here, and we've got a few like Dan Crenshaw who are real veterans, and Tammy Duckworth. But when you look at these Israeli politicians, I mean, the man leading the right and the man leading the left are these guys who stormed a plane and whacked terrorists, 20 years before, and they are running against each other. It's amazing. These are real war heroes in essence, running against each other here. And Ehud Barak is known for his work in the spec ops field. I know a number of people who work with him. Lots of people have generally good things to say in some areas, and they have some very strong critiques in others. And that's an interesting thing about Israeli military people. They'll sit there and you listen to what they really have to say about someone and behind the scenes, and something they'll be like, he was okay, whatever. But on this particular thing he did, and on this other thing he just, this was terrible leadership. And it was like, wow, I never thought about that. Okay, so the election for prime minister in 1999 came out overwhelmingly for Ehud Barak. He won 56.1% of the vote to Bibi's 43.9, 1.79 million votes, almost 1.8 for Barak, and 1.4 for Bibi. All right. And once again, and this is, you're going to see that fragmentation again here in these votes. You can see why this direct election thing is falling apart, because Labour earned 20.3% of the vote in the proportional election. Right? So here you have Ehud Barak, who won 56% in the national prime minister election. So he has the confidence of a vast majority of Israelis. But his party won 26 seats in the Knesset, down 11 from the 34 that they'd held in the previous Knesset. Right? They were up considerable seats. So it's down 11. In any case, there you have it. I mean, Likud won 14%, 19 seats, right? Significantly down from the 96 election. And, again, you see Shas and Meretz coming up a little bit if you look at the deep down in the results. But the fact is, this fragmentation, this voting for prime minister and then not voting for that prime minister's party is a major problem, a major flaw in this particular system. All right, so Ehud Barak got into office. He began his negotiations with Arafat that were ongoing for about a year. They didn't produce anything. The Clinton administration tried to keep those negotiations alive right to the end, but the incoming Bush administration had won ever so narrowly the 2000 election, was not at all interested in this peace process because it had died. It really had. The Arafat had given it up and had launched another intifada. And so there was this campaign of violence and campaign of terrorism going on in Israel, and somehow the U.S. administration just ignores that and keeps pressing forward with the same policy. Unfortunately, obviously, the incoming administration, the Bush administration, was ready to make a change. This campaign of violence grew worse and worse. There was a bombing at a Tel Aviv nightclub that I remember very much. It struck me because back then, of course, I was a young man going to college myself, and so I would go out with my friends and party like that. And then all of a sudden I see on the news, this blast, and they were showing live footage of the ambulances showing up at the club that night, and it really struck me personally, like, wow, this really, this terrorism really is personal, and it's destructive, and it's horrific. A lot of people died that night, and they were just, young people out having fun, being terrorized by these people. So as that happened, slowly but surely, Barak's coalition began to fracture. And one of the problems, and I may have mentioned this before as well, is that while a lot of people wanted a secular coalition, they wanted Barak to form a coalition without the ultra-Orthodox parties, he ultimately did bring Shas into the coalition. Well, a funny thing happened. Shas found an excuse to break up the coalition. Their excuse was that El Al was going to be allowed to fly on Shabbat, and so their argument was, well, El Al can't fly on Shabbat, therefore we're gonna break the coalition and we're out of here. And so new elections were called, but they decided at that point they were just going to have the election for prime minister, not for parliament as well. And that created an interesting situation. There's a great story that Yoel Hasson told me about how he and Ariel Sharon is also a Likudnik, were sitting together that night, and Sharon said, Bibi's going to announce tomorrow that he's running, and he said to his friend Yoel, he said, look, you're young, you have a career ahead of you, you should go over to Bibi and you should work with him because you'll have a chance to win and be with the winner, and you'll have a better career in Likud if you work with him. And Yoel said, you know what, no, I'm here, I'm your political supporter, I'm going to help you. So that night they made phone calls to all the political bigwigs and talked with them and said, hey, Ariel Sharon, I'm running. And, he called the top people, and Yoel and several other supporters called a lot of the Central Committee members and just let them know, hey, Ariel Sharon is running, all this kind of thing. And the next day, Bibi announced that he would not be running for prime minister because he would not run unless there were also Knesset elections. Obviously, he saw the fragmentation that had gone on, and he did not want to try to form a coalition under those circumstances. And that was a huge political change. Of course, then Ariel Sharon then became the main candidate for Likud, for the right. And so Yoel Hasson said, he had stuck with the right, he backed the right horse. He had stuck with the right leader. And Ariel Sharon would make some big changes in Israel in the future. In any case, that direct election came out 62% for Ariel Sharon. It was almost 1.7 million votes for him, just over 1 million votes for Ehud Barak. The level of change and confidence there is remarkable. Just vast, overwhelming support for Sharon because they wanted someone who could tighten up the security situation. And tighten he did. He got into office. He was able to knit together a coalition, complicated though it was. He restored security to the situation. And by the 2003 election, we saw Likud win 38 seats. And that shows you that Likud was gaining as a faction. And for whatever reason, to advance his own agenda in 2005 after the Gaza withdrawal, Ariel Sharon would leave Likud, splitting Likud again, creating Kadima that would really weaken the traditional left. And since then, we've had this sort of center-left, this new center-left that Yair Lapid ultimately stepped into as Kadima fell apart, that is rejuvenating the Israeli left, because the traditional left is very socialist and left in a very internationalist sense, but the center-left is more free market, concerned about social issues, things of that nature. So this is the history of direct election. After the 2001 direct election, the Israelis got rid of it. They eliminated the direct election for prime minister. Right now, we're in a unique situation, though. An opportunity here for a one-time election could just settle that question. Because here's the big question that everyone's on. Should Bibi Netanyahu be prime minister? Right? That is the question in everyone's mind. And we're running this question through this parliamentary system of votes and whatever, these parties and these factions. And, I've gone over the math with you, 52 seats for this group and maybe 59 if for pro-Bibi if Yamina joins them. And, then on the other side, it's like, well, you've got 51 seats that are against Bibi. And maybe if some of the Arabs join, it'd be higher. Maybe if Yamina join, you're looking at that. And where's the answer in all that? Right? Where's the conclusion? Where's the decision? Right? We don't have that decisive election that's there. We don't have a firm result. So a direct election could absolve us of this question. It could finally answer, do Israelis want Bibi Netanyahu to continue as prime minister, or would they prefer someone else? And this has to be a head-to-head question. It can't be, well, maybe everyone would be okay if Gideon Sa'ar was prime minister instead, or if Naftali Bennett was prime minister instead. All of the candidates are going to have to run. And I think that we may see Bennett run, we may not. That would be an interesting question. It could end up being Lapid and Bibi head-to-head. There are a lot of people on the left who want to see Yair Lapid run, in part because they're kind of hoping that he fails. Because if he were to fail, then maybe Benny Gantz could come back into the fold. On the other hand, maybe they all run. Maybe all Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, Gideon Sa'ar, Naftali Bennett, and Bibi Netanyahu, and the five of them all run and see who wants to be prime minister, and then whoever are the top two, which would probably be Bibi and Lapid. But you never know. Maybe it's Bibi and Naftali Bennett. It's one of the reasons I don't think Bennett would run, because he could kind of sit back and work with the winner. But maybe it's possible he could be in the runoff, and if he were, it could put him in a position to be the candidate if Bibi's not going to be prime minister, the candidate to unseat him. Could it be Bibi versus Gideon Sa'ar? It'll be interesting to see what would happen if that happens. But we're a little bit of a ways from that. They have to find the 61 votes to make that change first and foremost. Changes to election laws have to be an absolute majority of Parliament. And then it has to clear the Supreme Court, who has to be willing to accept this major reform from a caretaker government. And then they could hold the election. And if there are only two candidates, obviously one will win. If there are more than two candidates, there's a good chance there'll be a runoff, and the runoff election will be the one that determines the results. In any event, now you've heard about direct election of the prime minister in Israel and its pros and cons, why it failed in the past, and why it could be a reasonable way out of the situation now, rather than continuing to hold these inconclusive elections in the proportional system because a number of political leaders just refuse to negotiate a coalition deal with Bibi, and Bibi refuses to quit. So there's no answer there until the voters actually ring in on that question. And it could be interesting to see how that goes. Like I said, I think Bibi has a very good chance of winning it, and that's probably why people on the left are not so keen on going that approach, because if he won 51% or more, that's a mandate for him to be prime minister. And obviously, that's not what they're looking for. In any case, we'll have more news over the coming week. Now that Israeli Independence Day is over, Sunday's a work day in Israel. Over the course of this week, we're going to get some real negotiation taking place. And we'll see what they pound out, what kind of things are going to start happening. Maybe Bibi can get Smotrich into the coalition and Bennett and figure all of those things out, nail down those variables, and then he'd be left just 2 seats away from a majority. Maybe he can't, and we'll see what happens. Maybe they'll decide to go ahead and hold a direct election. Maybe they won't. But this is the direction that needs to go on here. At some point, somehow, some government needs to come together, and this needs to be over, because the Israeli politicians need to act like grown-ups and lead the country and not just constantly hold to gridlock. Somebody's going to have to give somewhere, and we'll see who blinks. If there's a direct election, that may answer the question right then and there. With that, I will say goodbye. להתראות.
אולי נפליגה בספינות מחוף אילת עד חוף של הר, ועל המשחטות הישנות יטעינו תפוחי זהב.